Okay. Where is she, right? Because in the TV ad, it starts with her being quite close to the camera, and then the camera comes back so you can see the whole chart. And of course, she's not very big there. But this is what we're passing on to our kids and our grandkids. And don't we normally want to pass on to our kids and grandkids a legacy of assets? Okay. I mean, normally parents want to do that. And so Julie and I could say, well, instead of passing on any assets, we'll just pass on a debt. I don't think that's, obviously we're not going to do that, but that's not where you're going to want to be. How serious is this? Well, the total, 16 plus trillion, I think you know, is now greater than all of our income as a country for a year, which we call our gross domestic product. And that is on August 3rd of last year, we passed all of our income for a total year with this debt. Right now, just to pay the interest, 20% of all the money being collected by the federal government is being used to pay interest on the debt. I see that as money down a rat hole, and I see that as extraordinary irresponsibility. Now, another thing that is significant is, given the trend, if this trend continues, in about 3 years, we'll be paying more for interest on the national debt than we'll be paying for everything in national defense. And keep in mind, our Constitution and our federal government was formed for the purpose of national defense. And when you're paying more for interest on your debt than for the purpose for which the government was formed, obviously something isn't the way it should be. And I'm just stating the obvious. But I'd like to ask this question too. What if you were on the board of control of any organization? It could be a church, it could be a business, it could be a senior citizen group, it could be any organization. And the debt of your organization looked like this. How many of you would say, I think we'll just keep doing what we're doing? Nobody's going to say that. Nobody's going to say that. And this is the choice that's going to be before the voters in the 1st District come November 6th. Do you think we should keep doing what we're doing? And I have total confidence that the voters are going to say, I mean, there is no way. Obviously, we have to make major changes. Given the trend, we're 5 years away from where Greece is today in terms of our debt to GDP ratio. Is it that serious? It is that serious. Now let me just add to that. One of the people I like to read is a guy by the name of Mark Stein, who writes for National Review. He's sometimes on for Rush. I think he's a very astute observer of the world. A few weeks ago, writing in National Review online, he said he returned from Australia, and Australia economically is doing very well. Their last quarter GDP growth was over 5%. Ours was less than 2%. But anyway, Stein says in Australia, the business leaders, the government leaders, and the like are convinced that we, as a country, financially, are going down. Okay? And they are planning their governmental program, their business programs, under that assumption that the United States is headed for financial collapse. According to Mark Stein, June 11th, National Review. I'm here to do what I can to see to it that that doesn't happen. But obviously we have to change direction. Now before I talk about what I think we need to change, I want to show you another chart, which is also very significant. This chart is a little harder to see, but this chart pictures the growth in federal spending, top line, since 1970, versus the growth in personal income, bottom line, the green line. And this chart actually only goes to 2008. If we extended this to 2012, the growth in personal income would be 28%, because we've lost 4% in the last 4 years. The growth in the federal spending would be 300%. So the bottom line is that the federal government has grown 10 times faster than personal income. And that tells a pretty important story. Because when it comes to the question of what are we going to do about the debt, people with whom I'm going to differ, who will say, well, we have to raise taxes, I believe are being unrealistic, because part of the problem is that government has gotten too big. And to raise taxes is to allow it to get bigger or stay big. So when I look at this chart, and when I first saw this on the internet, where I do a lot of my research, it reminded me of something that I did when I was in my 20s at the county fair. And one of the things that a number of us did at the county fair is we would participate in the tractor pull contest. And I had my own tractor. I entered a couple of times. But the way we did it back then is we would have a tractor pulling a sled, and there would be some weight on the sled, but then the sled would come down the track, and a lot of us would line up on both sides of the track, and as the sled came by, we would step on. Anybody else here ever do that? See it done? Anyway, we would step on to put more weight on the sled. And we'd have this, whatever, 466 John Deere engine, whatever it was, chugging along very nicely. But as more and more weight got on the sled, it would reach a point where the tractor would stop. Wouldn't have the traction, wouldn't have enough horsepower, or whatever. So eventually, the weight was there, the tractor would stop. Then it would come with a bigger tractor. Would start with more weight on the sled, and it didn't matter if you had a bigger tractor, you keep adding weight, you'd reach a point where the tractor would stop. That's what is happening here. This growth in government is all added weight, some of it dead weight, but added weight on our economic system. And the engine of free enterprise, like any other engine, can only carry so much weight, can only have so much drag. And you reach a point where the drag is such that you can't have a vibrant recovery from recession, and that's why we are where we are. Why is unemployment stuck at the 8.2 range? Why in the last month did we have more people go on disability than found new employment? Why have so many people left the job market? Okay? Why don't we have a gangbusters economic recovery? It's because there is too much weight on the sled. And the engine can be strong, and our economic engine is strong. But even with a strong engine, you put too much weight on the sled, and the engine can't pull the load. And so I am convinced that as we shrink government, we have to also free up the engine of free enterprise so that we can create more jobs, so that we can create tax revenue, and we can do that at the same time. But I think this chart makes it clear that raising taxes is the wrong solution. Is the wrong way to go. So let me go back to the debt, because I'd like to describe too the difference in approach that I take to this versus the difference of approach that Congressman Walz takes. Congressman Walz has made it very clear that he believes the way to deal with the debt crisis, and I am going to use the word debt crisis because it is. It's not just a problem. Look at the trends, look at the inability of Washington to deal with this. This is a crisis. Mr. Walz says the way to deal with the debt issue, I'm going to say a crisis, is for the federal government to spend even more. Now, I want you to know I'm convinced that that is fantasy land, a fantasy land non-solution. Now, it comes from the theory that you have to prime the pump. You have to stimulate the economy. But for 2011, 36 cents out of every federal dollar spent was borrowed. That is priming the pump, stimulus, mega stimulus by definition. And so 36 cents out of every dollar spent is borrowed, and you're telling me that to get out of this you have to spend even more? I am convinced, and I think it's the only reasonable solution, is to recognize the federal government is too big, spends too much. We have to shrink the size of the government. We have to put a limit on what we can spend in order to free up the engine of free enterprise, we have to take some weight off the sled. And so what I am proposing, and right now there are about 85 members of the House of Representatives who see this basically the same way as I do. And if I'm elected, I intend to join this group of 85 that, God willing, is going to be 125 after the election. We don't know. But what I believe, and this 85 group of 85 believes, is that we have to reduce government spending systematically, and I am committed to balancing the budget in 5 years or less. So how do we do that? We do it by setting a limit on how much we can spend each year. And essentially we have to reduce spending by about $200 billion each year and loosen up, free up the engine of free enterprise, and then we can balance the budget. So that means we have to stop doing some of the things we're doing. Now I'm going to mention just a couple things. You want me to talk about more, I'd be happy to. Examples: corporate welfare. We so far have sucked $36 billion into General Motors. What do we have to show for it? We've got the Chevy Bolt to show for it. Is that a good use of our money? When General Motors could have declared bankruptcy, as Northwest Airlines did, and could have become a leaner, meaner, more competitive machine. So $36 billion that is worse than money down a rat hole is $36 billion that in fact has made GM less competitive in the world marketplace. I think that's a huge mistake. Let me mention something else. Medicaid fraud at the upper levels. And there's one candidate for Congress in the state that's been making an issue of Medicaid fraud, and I'm the guy. Why? Because according to the research team on Congressman Isa's committee in DC, Medicaid fraud, I'm not talking about the people at the bottom, I'm talking about people at the top, state governments, HMOs, and things like that, could be costing us as much as $100 billion a year. So when you have to cut the spending by $200 billion, potentially, here's half of it that can be recaptured without cutting any programs. One of the things that Australia has done is crack down on fraud. We need to do the same. Both the federal government and the state government have basically been looking at fraud with a nod and a wink. And folks, we don't have the money to do that. I mean, I think it's terrible anyway, but we can't afford to keep doing that. So those are just a couple examples, and if you want to ask me later, I'll give you a bunch more. But I do want to add one more that I think is a microcosm of what's going on. Mankato Free Press, about 3 weeks ago, or a little less, had an article about a experiment study, I guess I should say, study being done north of Grand Rapids, where the federal government is spending $50 million, and that's real money, okay, to study the effects of climate change on peat bogs. And I frankly think that is a study we can do without. So, I mean, believe it or not, the federal government is building greenhouses out in the peat bogs and is going to artificially heat the peat bogs in these greenhouses to see the effects of artificial climate change. So, you know, if that were just one $50 million study, it wouldn't be so bad. The problem is that's being repeated hundreds and hundreds of times in a variety of ways in our country. How do you stop that? You stop it by setting a limit on how much you can spend, and then you have to prioritize. Right now, there's not much prioritizing going on in the federal government. You have to prioritize. Okay, I'm going to make just one more comment, and then I'd love to have deal with your questions. I should mention, too, that the approach that Mr. Perry takes to this is also very different from mine. Because he will say we have to balance the budget, but he never puts a time limit on it. I say we have to balance the budget in 5 years or less. He ends the sentence after balance the budget. And that is, in fact, what our two positions are. Now, does it matter? Well, I have spent most of my life as a teacher, and I imagine giving an assignment to a class, I want you to do a paper in such and such, but I don't give a due date. And the students, of course, are going to ask me, they're going to say, well, Professor Quist, when is this due? Now imagine me saying, well, you know, when you think the time is right.